Okay, so we are live on YouTube, which is fun. So if you guys want to come back to this later, you'll be able to do that. But here's what I wanted to share. So we've got a NABOR contract where, oh, this guy's gone. We've got a NABOR contract and it is an as-is contract. So this would work if it was a FAR contract, and it obviously would work if it's a NABOR contract. Here's the tricky part. And I feel bad for people in this market because you're asked to know 4 different contracts, which I think is too many, honestly. It's too much for me most of the time. So you have to know the 2 as-is contracts, FAR and NABOR, and then you also have to know the 2 standard contracts under FAR and NABOR as well. That's overwhelming, but I'll make it very simple for you. On when you're using an as-is contract, they both work pretty much the same, especially because the biggest change is inspection rights. How does this work? What is right? What is wrong about what we're doing? And so this morning we actually had 2 different contracts with kind of similar issues, and hopefully this will help you kind of understand how to think through this and not to overthink it, but to think about it clearly and to be clear with your clients. So this is a NABOR as-is contract. And this was the addendum that was proposed to the seller. Addendum to sales contract, list of defective items. And let's read a couple of them. 1 or more walls in the attic were damaged, seller to have a licensed contract evaluate repair if necessary. Let's look at the next one. GFC outlet did not function properly in the kitchen. All functioning GFC outlets should be replaced, and all wet areas need to have GFC outlets installed by a licensed electrician. Number 3, 10 years is the maximum recommended life of a smoke detector. Are you sensing what happened here? I'll tell you what happened. The buyers and their agent copied the report from the inspection and put it on here. And they say list of defective items. And they asked the buyer signed it. They're asking the seller to sign it as well. It might work the way they have it, but it's not my preference. Number 1, on an as-is contract, there are no defective items. That's not something ever referenced in those as-is contracts because it's as-is. Seller's not obligated to make any repairs. Buyer doesn't have to define any defects in order to potentially get out of the deal. It's just, it's more of a wild, wild west. You have an inspection period. Buyer can negotiate with the seller on repairs. And the only reason they can do that is because they have the leverage. They could back out if the seller doesn't work with them. So number 1, on an as-is contract, we're not talking about defects. That's not something we have to reference. What we are talking about in this case is what is the seller agreeing to do to keep the deal together? Is the seller agreeing to do nothing? Then don't sign an addendum. You know, if you're the listing agent, you would get this and you would say, we're not willing to do anything. We hope that you still want to move forward, but we understand you have the right to terminate. You may be willing to do a couple of things. So GFCI outlets, you might be willing to do that. So what I would do instead of this is I would say seller shall complete the following items at its sole cost and expense prior to closing. And then I would bullet point each of the items. So bullet point number 1, repair or replace all defective GFCI outlets. Or you could even be more specific, repair or replace all GFCI outlets in the bathroom. That's really straightforward. What we don't want is this language, which potentially means that the seller has to go around and evaluate if a GFCI outlet has to be added that doesn't exist currently. I don't want the seller taking on that responsibility because adding GFCI outlets is a very, very different than like replacing existing ones. So specify exactly what your seller is going to do. Number 2, smoke detectors. Does the seller have to fix smoke detectors just because they're more than 10 years old? No, definitely not. If they're still operating, great. And you could probably pretty easily tell the buyer, I'm not doing this. We're not going to make these repairs. We'll let the buyer do it. Or you could say seller will replace all smoke detectors with with new detectors, something like that. You could seller shall replace all smoke detectors. It'd be pretty easy. That wouldn't be very expensive. You don't need to hire an electrician to do it usually. So maybe they're willing to do that. Windows don't lock properly. So maybe instead we bullet point, we say seller shall replace all broken window locks so that they're fully operable. So you see where we're going here. You don't have to define if it's defective or not. Just define what your seller's willing to do. And even better, you may already know where I'm going to go with this, offer credit. It's really hard to get contractors right now, especially for these little items, things that may or may not be terribly important today. It'd be nicer if we could just give some money to the buyer and they can get it fixed at their leisure. I would probably prefer that. So that's the big thing on an as-is contract. We are going to use an addendum or an amendment. Either one would be fine. But you're going to list what the seller is willing to do, or the buyer agrees and the seller agrees to do. You don't have to define defective items, and I definitely don't want you copy and paste from the report. I think that their inspectors don't write their reports so that you can copy and paste them. We have to take what they're giving us and determine exactly what we want the seller to do. And ideally, I would love to give them the credit if possible. So that's a big one.
How do you determine the credit, the amount of the credit?
Well, it's just negotiated. So if we were to say there are 4 things, so let's say it's let's see, number 2, 3, and 4, GFCI outlets, smoke detectors, and the window locks. I don't know, maybe $500. If the buyer goes for it, then we got a deal. If the buyer says 500, that's crazy, I need 800, and say, okay, then it's 800. The contract doesn't specify how you get to that number. You're just renegotiating the sales price, essentially. Buyer has the leverage to get out, and therefore we kind of have to entertain it. I would say on this list, the thing that makes me the most nervous is number 5. I know these aren't numbered, but it's the 5th thing. There appears to be evidence of previous/active water damage in the guest bedroom and master bathroom. Seller to have a licensed contractor evaluate and repair if necessary. So I'll give you more context on this deal. The listing agent's not aware of any water damage, and there wasn't anything listed in the inspection report that highlighted that. So they were kind of confused as to where that came from. So before you agree to fix something like that, you'd want to talk to the buyer's agent and get a better idea of like, all right, what do they actually want? Because it could be a prior roof leak, or it could be an active roof leak. And so that's probably the one thing that I'd want to push and see what exactly is going on there. And ultimately, Valerie, to your question, I'll give you a different context, a different scenario. When I bought my house, there were like 10 things. The biggest thing was a roof. The roof was way past its age and it actually had 2 active leaks. So I knew I needed a new roof. Then 2, there was an open permit for something that was repaired, but it wasn't closed out. And then there were a bunch of other tiny little things. The seller was not from here. He was remote. And so I wasn't going to ask him to fix all this stuff and delay closing and just kind of be difficult. I was like, I just want some money. I want a new roof, and all the other things I'll ignore. I'll do it on my own time. But if you can help me with the roof, then I'll be happy. And so I made a proposal. I said, hey, give me the 40 grand and I'll ignore all the other stuff and we'll move forward. And the seller agreed. But they could have come back and said, hey, I'll offer you 15,000 or 20,000. Let's split the roof and you take on responsibility of everything else. I probably would have said yes to that too. So let's just communicate. Let's figure out what works for both parties. Does that help?
Yes.
Christian, can I ask you a question as well?
I'll allow it.
Yeah, pardon my ignorance because I'm newer to Florida. But putting myself in the seller's shoes, it's like I would kind of ask, well, why'd you even sign an as-is contract if you're spelling out repairs that you want done?
Yeah.
Why did they not just go with a standard contract then? All
right, so I love that question. The as-is contract, another way to say it is that it is an as-is contract subject to a due diligence period. So I'm going to make you an offer given the facts that I have, given the seller disclosure, given the pictures of my walkthrough of the property before I made my offer, but I don't really know what's going on at that house. I didn't realize that the roof is leaking actively. Yeah, I knew it was 10 years old, but I didn't realize it was leaking. Or I didn't realize there was water damage in the master bathroom. So the terms have changed. It is not what I thought I was buying. Or alternatively, hey, this is exactly what I thought I was buying. I was disclosed everything. I'm not renegotiating. We're not going to do that. If I'm the seller, and this, I think a lot of people could disagree with me on, so I'm going to allow you to do that as well. Most people in this town, in this area, Southwest Florida, they like the standard contract. They want the buyer to only be able to back out if there's a specific defect that the seller refuses to fix. That sounds like a more secure deal for most agents and potentially most sellers. I run counter to that. I believe that the most secure deal is one that was negotiated freely between buyer and seller. That if I give the buyer 5, 6, 7 days of due diligence and they still want to move forward, I've got a more secure deal because I allowed them a free look. I allowed them to come in, walk away for any reason. But after that 7 days, you are locked in. Your inspection period is done. We're over that. So you give up a little bit as a seller by doing an as is in those first 7 days, but after 7 days, you're done. Like it's as secure as ever. Your buyer had the option to leave and they chose to stay anyways. So that's why I like the as is contract, even as a seller. When I sold my house in Atlanta a year and a half ago, I used an as is contract as the seller because I was getting top dollar. I had a lot of buyers who were interested in the property. I think I got 20 offers. I chose one. It was way over what I was asking for. So I was very happy. But I wanted to make sure that that buyer wasn't going to get squirmy or bitter or anything later. So I gave them, I think it was only 5 days. It wasn't that much. We were off the market for 5 days while they did their inspections. They didn't ask for anything. They probably could have. They could have asked for, $500 for GFCI outlets or something. But they chose not to, and we kept the deal together. And I felt great because I gave them the option to do their own inspection. And after that, after 5 days, we were done. It was a done deal. The deposit was non-refundable at that point. So, Larry, I hope that makes sense. It's just my opinion. It's how I see these deals. But you're not wrong to think that a more structured deal, more safe deal for a seller could be a standard.
No, I so appreciate your answer. And to me, it makes a whole lot of sense. Thanks for simplifying that so well. But now let me ask you this, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like the as-is contract is going to be a little bit more favorable for the buyer than the seller, whether it's through NABOR or FARBAR, correct?
Yeah, for that inspection period, an as-is contract is more favorable for a buyer. Absolutely.
And that's a 7-day window that we're looking at. And
well,
then
the default is 15 days.
Okay.
But I think 15 days is ridiculous. I think that's way too long. Now, here's the interesting part. Let me see. I don't know if you'll be able to see this. I hope so. All right. So this is my cool little whiteboard here. So we're gonna use we're gonna use the standard contract in NABOR. FARBAR treats this very differently. So let's say, Larry, how many days do you want for your inspection period? So you're the seller. You want to tighten this up as much as possible. How many days are you going to give me?
7.
7 days. All right. So 7-day inspection.
Do you ever see 5?
Yes.
And
all right,
how
so
realistic
NABOR,
is that?
let's say this is a standard contract, right? So we are looking for defects on NABOR contract. This is not an as is. So you gave me a 7-day inspection. Let's say you changed it. Now you want to give me 5. That sounds great for a seller, right? Be careful. It's not that great because my buyer has 5 days to do their inspection. So I'm going to get my inspector, my general contractor. I'm going to do a sewer inspection. order a survey and do all that stuff in my 5 days. I'm going to do my inspections in 5 days. Then I have 5 more days to make my election. And so there is a form in NABOR called the buyer election and seller response, where the buyer has 5 days after inspection. So now collectively, we've actually been under inspection period for 10 days. Yikes. That, if you didn't disclose that to your seller, or if you didn't realize it yourself, that could be a real ugly turning point between you and your client. I've seen it a million times where you didn't tell me they had another 5 days to actually make their election. It gets trickier because, we might have a backup contract. We might have another deal that we're trying to buy, and it's contingent on this one actually going past due diligence. It gets trickier. The seller has 10 days to respond. We're in 20 days, and we're just now figuring out if we have a deal. I hate this about the NABOR contract. It drives me crazy. I agreed to 5. Larry, did you know you were agreeing to 20 when you put 5 on the contract?
No.
No, it's crazy. Now, the reality is these timelines get cleaned up. They get tightened because the buyer doesn't have to take 5 days to do all their inspections. They don't have to take another 5 days to do their election. This is just like worst case scenario. Maybe they do all their inspections in day 3, they get you their election on day 4, and then the seller immediately responds that same day and says, you got a deal, right? It could be a 4-day thing. But if the buyer takes all 5 days to do their inspections, and then they take another 5 days because it was the weekend or they were out of town or whatever, they take the full 10 days, and then the seller has their opportunity to respond, and now they're out of town, or they're waiting for that deposit, that second deposit to get made. So while all this is going on, Larry put together the deal that said the first deposit is $5,000 due now. And Larry, you said, give them the second deposit is going to be due on day 6 after their due diligence, right? So day 6, so second deposit, we want $50,000. So on day 6, we want $50,000. We haven't even made our election, and the buyer's obligated to send in their second deposit. And so what happens is that the buyer's freaked out because they don't know how the seller is going to respond. They don't know if the seller is going to agree to fix the roof tile because it's not technically a defect, but it's important to the spouse. It's important to the buyer. And then the seller, maybe they have their full election. Maybe they have everything in day 5 or 6. And so the seller just waits to respond. They wait to respond because they haven't gotten the second deposit back. So they're like, all right, well, we know what we want to say. We know how we're going to respond. We're going to wait till the buyer puts that second deposit down. We're going to make sure the buyer's fully invested. Because $5,000, you're not fully invested. $55,000, you are fully invested. Now the buyer is going to think twice about backing out of the deal just because we're disagreeing over whether something is a defect or not. This is messy. I don't like this. I don't like that because it's confusing. It's not very clear to the buyers and sellers. You have to do a lot of these deals to understand how that's what's going on. So let's change it to a FAR contract. Again, this is standard FAR contract. FAR is great for the sole reason that you can use it across the state. It's a great contract because every realtor in the state of Florida should know how to use a FAR contract. That's its biggest benefit. If you've got an agent coming in from Lee County or Charlotte County or Miami or Jacksonville or wherever, we can do these deals. They speak this language already. They don't know NABOR. So FAR, the other great thing is if Larry negotiates that same 5-day inspection, it includes their election. Now, the seller's still gonna have an opportunity to respond and do all that, but the 5 days is baked in for the buyer's inspection and election. Everything has to get done in those 5 days, and it just shortened up your deal. I can't remember off the top of my head what the seller's option or how much time they have to respond. It might be as short as 5 days. So in that sense, even on a 5-day deal, we know what we've got by day 10. I'm hoping that it says 5 days because this is going on the internet and everyone will let me know. But that's a lot cleaner. I like that. I like that a lot. If it was an as-is contract on either FARBAR or NABOR, as is, everything is baked in together. The inspection, the election, and it's not called an election on an as-is contract, and response. They don't even call it that really. This is all within your due diligence. All three of them, whether it's NABOR or FARBAR, because your client, whether it's the buyer or the seller, they've got to get this done during their due diligence. After due diligence, the deal is it's as is. There's no changes to the contract. The buyer loses all their leverage. If they walked away, they would lose their earnest money. But we know in day 5 if we've got a deal. So Larry, on my example, on my house, we have 5-day inspection. They did their inspection on day 2 or 3. I think we went under contract on a Monday. So we went under contract on a Monday. Their inspector was out there by Wednesday. They had their report by Wednesday night. And by Thursday, they had told me, we're good. We're going to move forward to closing. And that's awesome. That was great for me because I didn't miss a weekend. If we were under a NABOR standard contract, I might have missed 3 weekends of being on the market. And I would have been really upset if I didn't get to keep the earnest money or have a deal. The as-is protected me as the seller. It kept the buyer honest. We didn't have to spend money on legal fees, negotiating over whether something's a defect or not. It was just more secure. It was a more secure deal. I want to talk about one other thing. I don't know if you noticed, I love my my new awards that we got for this year. I just noticed it in the video. I had to point that out. One other thing. There's one big thing you need to remember on the FARBAR contract, on a standard FARBAR contract, and that is the seller is obligated to fix defects that a buyer finds. They don't have the choice to say yes or no. NABOR, the buyer makes their election and the seller can choose. I'm going to do it. I'm not going to do it. And if the seller says, I'm not going to do it, the buyer can walk away and keep their earnest money. Under a FARBAR contract, that same thing. Buyer finds certain defects, tells the seller, hey, you have to fix X, Y, and Z. And the seller can't say no. The only scenario that they could say no is if it was over the limit. Because if you've looked at the FARBAR contracts, it has a limit for the amount the seller is obligated. 1.5% is the default. So on $1 million deal, the seller is already obligating themselves to fix 1.5% or 15,000 in damage to the property, like a roof leak or maybe a broken appliance or things like that. 1.5% towards doing off the top of my head. I think it's wood destroying organisms and then mold, right? So those are I think those are your 3 categories. So maximum, the seller, by signing $1 million contract on a standard FARBAR contract, potentially is agreeing to a $955,000 contract because 1.5% of each of those items is what they're obligating themselves to. I don't think a lot of sellers know that. I don't think they realize that that's what they're agreeing to. Doesn't usually come that way. Usually what happens is they find one thing that's wrong with the house. And so it's really a $15,000 liability the seller is obligated to do. And if it's over the 15,000, if it's over the 1.5%, then the parties can terminate. I think the seller can agree to come up, or the buyer can agree to walk away and keep their money. It's messy. It's messy, and that's why I feel bad when I said up front. I feel bad that people have to know 4 contracts. I think it's a lot. It is a lot. So if you're going to be forcing yourself to learn 4 contracts, one of the benefits of sticking to an as is that they're a lot more similar than the standard contracts. There's less for you to worry about. There's less mistakes you could make doing them. And it's hopefully going to build goodwill. I may have brought this up last week, but I want to bring it up again. I have a buyer who did a standard NABOR contract on a house. And he found out day 2 or 3 that he couldn't get insurance because of something with the pool cage. And he wanted out. He didn't have the option. Even though he was in his inspection period, he doesn't have the right to terminate because he can't get insurance under the NABOR contract. So if he was on an as-is contract, would have protected the buyer. And then if we look at the seller's like, oh, okay, well, we didn't get the deal, but at least I get the earnest money. I think it was $5,000. Buyer is really salty about it. They were not happy. They didn't agree to release the $5,000. They're fighting it. And so the seller doesn't get the $5,000 right now either. The seller, I'm entitled to that money, this and that. If instead we had an as-is contract, buyer could terminate, doesn't have to give an excuse, and seller would have to understand. Seller would be like, okay, let's put it back on the market. But, and that, if it was within 5 days, I think your seller would accept it. But instead, even though it was within 5 days, the seller was told, hey, the contract says that's your money. Oh, I'm going to fight for it. I don't think that helps us. I really don't. I don't think that we should be doing deals that set up our clients to be confrontational or litigious. I would rather it just be very straightforward. If you find something that you weren't expecting and it's big enough for you to ask me for it, I'll consider it. That's what it should be. But I actually did another deal this morning. It's a NABOR contract. Couple of things on this one. They chose the due diligence inspection, so they tried to make this into an as-is contract using the standard form. If you do that, you have to attach the addendum. There's a special addendum on that one. And then what they did is they did this addendum instead. Let me see if I can hide whose deal this is. So buyer will not expect seller to cover any inspections items unless the items are 1, 2, 3, mold, radon, or roof leakage. I don't like this. I don't think it's necessary. It doesn't make sense from a contract perspective. This is more of it's a show of goodwill. Hey, we're not going to nickel and dime you. We realize that you gave us a great price on it, but we are reserving the right to object to these items. Why don't we just do an as-is contract and you just tell the seller, hey, you gave me a good price, and the seller could do the same. The seller can tell the buyer, I gave you a good price. I'll give you the inspection period, but after 5 days, just so you know, I'm not going to be retrading on the price. You could find that the total roof needs to be replaced. You could find that there's, you need to fill in the pool. I'm not retrading on price, but I'll let you do your inspections so that you're going into it eyes wide open. To me, that is the way to do it. In today's Wednesday, I'll give you the weekend. Let's make this happen. I'll give you till Monday to make a decision of whether you're moving forward or not. Give you a chance to come down here on an airplane, get your inspector out, have a second look. That's so I like these deals. Sometimes that's not right for your situation. Sometimes it's not right for your seller. Sometimes you want to keep the buyer in the deal. I get it. I totally get it. A million ways to do it, that's for sure. Well, that's kind of a fun class. Does anyone have anything that they want to bring into the fold on that?
I had a question. Do you know if the new NABOR contracts if any of this language will be changing?
It's not changing. NABOR changed. You will see new contracts. I saw them for the first time yesterday. I don't know when they go official, probably January 1, if I were to guess. Most of the changes are clerical in nature. There was a couple of things changing, like there's a fee that the seller has to pay the buyer, $150 for title policy. I think that's going away. They changed some of the wording. Instead of calling it condos/homeowners association, you're just calling it association. But none of the, from what I can tell, none of these things are actually going to change the way that you prepare contracts and things you need to educate your client about. You'll just be able to kind of easily transition into the new forms.
Great.
Good
Thank you.
question, Valerie. Thank you. All right. Well, like I said before, these classes are all being hosted on YouTube. There are a couple on there already, but if you want to subscribe to that channel, you can. It's a lot of fun, and I hope to use it as a resource for everybody. But it's just youtube.com/Christian Ross. So actually, that went to not go to everybody. Hold on. So oddly enough, that they gave me my own handle on YouTube. Imagine that. All right, so I hope that is helpful. If you need me, please call me. I would love to help you and work on some of your deals. That would be a lot of fun.
Hey, thank you so much for your time and that a nice, simple explanation of these various contracts.
Welcome, Larry. I'm glad
Thank
things are
you,
going
Christian.
well.